Hello everyone, my name is Whitehead and welcome back to the Coach David and Ultimate YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be going over some of the LMGT3 daily races for this week, so let's see what we have in store. So, first things first, we're going to be going over the ELMS Sprint Cup daily race for this week, which is going to be held at Monza wet layout. So, not one of my favourite tracks, but it's the track that you got nonetheless, so let's go over how to do a lap. So, first of all, you got the notorious turn 1, which is obviously going to cause a lot of issues in the race at the start, as it always does. Be very, very careful with this corner. Very careful of all the heavy braking zones on this track, because there are quite a few of them. But obviously, you know, you're on a very trimmed down setup. You're going to be low wing, low rake. So you're going to be approaching the corner a lot quicker than usual than other tracks. And you're going to be, you know, braking potentially earlier than you think you should. So be very, very careful of that. Your car's not going to be braking as efficiently as it would do at other circuits. So bear that heavily in mind. So turn 1, you're going to be braking just after the 100-meter board. So I tend to use this barrier end on the right. I tend to try and get as close to that as I can. But if you're not kind of wanting to look over to the right-hand side, just go midway between the 150 and the 100-meter boards. Obviously car dependent, but in the Ferrari at least, that was pretty perfect. You can see here, brake about 130 meters, I'd say, away from the corner. Down to gear 1, hooking the inside curb, but being careful not to take the sausage. I think we take it just with the right rear corner. Yeah, you can see the right rear tyre just clips the sausage curb. Fortunately, it doesn't really throw us off course. Because what I tend to find is when you take the sausage curb, the car kind of bounces and sets you off for the left-hander. And you can see here, we're nice and far to the right-hand side, which means we're set up nicely for the left. Which means we can take the inside curb. We, again, clip the sausage ever so slightly with the left rear. We get back in the throttle nice and early. Only run a little bit this exit curb. You don't really want to run on the green or on the gravel because it can really inhibit traction. And obviously you want to make sure the exit is as good as it can be for this exit, because you've got a long old straight into quite a heavy braking zone, and obviously that's a very key overtaking point. So you want to try and minimise the opportunity that people get to overtake you back. And then it's just about carrying the shortest possible line around Curva Grande. And now coming into the second chicane. I'm not entirely sure what it's called. Unfortunately, I'm not good with names at Monza. It's one of the tracks I don't really drive a lot, so I'm a little bit bad with the corner names. But anyway, there's 2 different braking zones here, depending on the car and setup approach that you use. You can either brake at the 100-meter board or the orange barrier on the right-hand side, again, depending on car. We brake at the 100, which serves us absolutely perfectly. If anything, probably could have broke a little bit after the 100-meter board in this car, as you will see in a second. Down to gear 1, turning quite late because it's very easy to turn in too early, hit this curb on the left to, you know, a bad angle, and then it, you know, offsets you for the second part. We turn in nice and late, probably could have turned in still a little bit later. You can see we're basically aiming to only hit the back end of this sausage curb. You can see we hit the curb nice and smooth, which means we have a good exit, and we're able to basically take this curb as straight as possible. That's kind of what you're aiming to do, because the smoother or straighter you take this curb, the smoother you run it, the less you bounce afterwards. You can see we do get a bit of a bounce and a bit of a slide, but we still get a relatively smooth exit. And we're not on the gravel on the left, and we're not at risk of invalidating, which is a very important thing with the track limits being very harsh at Monza. And then coming into the first of 2 LMU corners, using the orange barrier on the right-hand side as a reference. Dabbing the brake just after it goes off screen, out of peripheral, so I'm usually using a bit more of a forwards or a frontwards camera position, so this will be out of my line of sight, and in fact it probably is out of line of your sight as well at this point. So if we go free cam, you can see it's just there on the left-hand side. We're not quite in line with it, but at least on screen it's pretty much out of vision, so that's generally where I use. And only, again, very short, very light braking zone, because you want to roll a lot of speed through, turning quite late, and then get back on the throttle, roughly again at this orange barrier on the right-hand side, or just before it. So in general, it is car dependent, you know, on how much throttle you use and when you apply it. But in the Ferrari at least, and also most cars that I've tried, you want to try and prioritize exit rotation rather than entry rotation, because if you go in and the car's too slidey, you'll hit the inside curb, and that will just completely inhibit all rotation. And also, exit rotation in this track is very important at the LMUs, especially because of the exit track limit. So you'll see here, we get on the throttle nice and early, and we're safely within track limits. But it's so easy to invalidate. We're actually quite close to invalidating here. So again, be very careful, especially if you come from ACC, where the track limits are a lot more lenient through the LMUs, but they are very, very harsh on LMU. Sorry. And now coming into the second LMU, braking just before the 50-meter board, keeping the gear the same, and again using that throttle rotation just before we get to the apex. We unfortunately have a bit of a slide, which lost us probably half a tenth. But again, we crucially keep within track limits, so that's the most important thing. The second LMU I find a lot more difficult to adhere to track limits than the first one, so it's always going to be the case that you need to be a bit more cautious through the second one, especially because you can't really, bide your time in the corner. The first one, for example, you can wait on the throttle before going there, so that you can, still roll speed through. But obviously, the second LMU is a lot more abrupt and a lot shorter, which means that you can't really compromise the corner as much in the midpoint. You have to, get it right on the entry for it to be better on the exit. So just bear that very much in mind, that it's better to go a bit slower in, make sure you're on the throttle nice and early, but still keeping in track limits. And now down towards Ascari, which is probably the most difficult corner on the circuit, simply on the basis of the car constantly trying to slide out from underneath you, and the first curb and the last curb being very brutal on track limits. So you'll see we actually got very, very close on 2 occasions in this Ascari chicane. Fortunately kept it on track. We're going to turn the first part, brake at the 100-meter board. Down to third gear, trailing in. You can see we are somehow in track limits here. We do actually run the white line with the right-hand tyres, but we're able to get there. I actually have a panic stab of throttle into here to make sure we don't invalidate. But what I would always recommend is turning a little earlier than you think for this corner, simply because of this curb. You're going to try and take the curb kind of parallel almost to this Astro sort of part with the green. I'll try and show here. So you can see the green and the Astro. If we go up wide, or up high, sorry, you can see we're running almost parallel with this. And if you try and turn in later, or try and turn in later and try and square off the corner, the car doesn't seem to ride the curb anywhere near as nicely, and you end up bouncing a little bit. So it's important to turn in a little bit earlier than you think for Ascari. Make sure you hook this left-hand curb, because it gives you quite a lot of grip. And what that then means is we come out of the first part quite far to the left-hand side, comparing to what you would expect, which means we can kind of set up this right-hander, hook the inside curb. We do hit the sausage a little bit, which I would honestly say is probably suboptimal. You want to try not to hit this inside curb on the right-hand side, because it can lead to the car being very snappy and oversteery. But in some occasions, in some cars, it does work. So the Ferrari, for example, if you don't take too much sausage curb, it should be fine. But again, the crucial part is making sure that you're able to take the left-hander with enough curb to hook you over, but obviously not taking too much curb where you invalidate, or not enough curb where you bounce. Because if you take a very small amount of this left-hand curb, you'll see you bounce quite high. So we managed to get over the sausage curb, keeping the car pinned. You can see we're firmly within track limits here as well, which is nice. I think the track limits on the exit are quite lenient, but obviously on that left-hand curb, they're very, very harsh. So do be wary that obviously you could get track limits, and obviously when you're in dirty air, the car's going to be a little more nervous as well and unpredictable. So yes, that is very important. But to see sort of more details of Ascari, let's look at the Coach Dave Delta data. Okay, so as mentioned, let's have a look at Ascari and figure out what you need to do to get this corner right. So you can see very heavy braking zone initially, obviously at the 100-meter board, as I mentioned. And you can see we're turning in basically as soon as we start trading off the brake. So you can see pretty much at the same time, we're starting to trail off and then starting to turn in. And then we're getting on that curb. You're waiting quite a lot before we get back on the throttle. That's the important thing, because if you get back on the throttle too early, you either have bad stability where the car will snap, which I had a few times in practice, or the car will just wash and you'll just understeer wide and you'll have to use the right hand curb a lot more than you hoped for, and you'll just have bad traction, bad bounces on the sausage curb. So you have to be very, very patient, and that is a big theme of Monza, is that you have to be very, very patient because you're constantly waiting for the car, essentially. If you're trying to be too, premature on the throttle, you're going to understeer off the track, or you're going to have a snap, especially because, again, the car's low wing, so your aero platform is not particularly, front end heavy. It's going to be a bit more lazy. It's going to be less draggy than it is usually, and less downforce. So you can have a lot less grip, and you need to be very, very wary of that, especially since there aren't that many mechanical grip corners. Obviously, the ones that are existing on the track are just chicanes, and then, the LMUs and obviously Ascari, they are aero dependent. So you've got to be a little bit patient and make sure that the car does its thing in the midpoint of the corner. And you can actually see, if we look across all these laps, there's quite a big coasting phase. You can see here, we're off the brake, coasting, 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 and then back on the throttle, only at the real midpoint of the corner. Even the second LMU, you can see there's even a coasting phase into here, despite how short the apex is. So, it's a very important thing that you need to remember that is, quite unique to Monza, I'd say, especially because usually you're trying to stabilize the car. Like, for example, at Spa, you're trying to almost stabilize the car sometimes on the throttle. But at Monza, you're not doing that, and you're just waiting for the car to actually rotate, and then get even more rotation on the throttle, depending on your setup, of course. So back to Ascari, you can see we're very patient at the throttle. Then we're back on the throttle as we exit off this curb, and then we're dancing the throttle a little bit through here, because if you go full throttle, you're just going to understeer completely wide. So again, we're using that curb on the right-hand side for a bit of rotation. But even if you're not, you're still going to be dancing on the throttle a little bit. You're not going to be planting it completely. And you can see then we're back on the throttle once the car is stabilized. You can see we're having a little bit of a jagged, correction of the steering. And then we're back to, being very smooth again through the left and pretty much flat all the way from Ascari to Parabolica. So you can see as well with the steering, very smooth movements. You can see like smooth lump there to the left, smooth bump to the right, a little bit of jaggedy movements, obviously to correct the car on the curb. But you can see, generally we're going left, right. So really, really smooth. That's very important at Ascari, because if you try and throw the car too much on the weight transfer phase, it will just slide and it will just snap. So, of course, your exit is very important, and that's what we've compromised on here. So let's get back to the lap guide towards Parabolica. And now, you've done that, now to Parabolica. So, pretty simple corner, in all honesty. It's a lot less complicated than it kind of appears sometimes on TV. Or at least on LMU, it's quite simple. You want to break out this digiboard on the left-hand side, down to gear 3. We're a little bit early on the throttle on this lap, unfortunately. But the main thing is just patience. Making sure you're waiting to get on the throttle, because you don't want to exit the corner too wide. You want to exit, if anything, a little bit more narrow. You can see we get back on the throttle. We do run it a little bit wide, but, we're still not on the AstroTurf. We're still not even on the white line. And that means we're able to bring the car right over to the right-hand side once again to start the next lap. So that, I believe, was a 49.7 on a race fuel. So let's go over the car choices and the stuff we need to consider for this daily race. So, what sort of things do we have to consider for the ELMS Sprint Cup races this week at Monza? So, first and foremost, it's a multi-class. There's ELMS LMP2, there's the LMP3, there's the LMGT3. And obviously you have Monza Turn 1. So, that's probably the most important thing from the outset to consider, is that corner exists. And it's the first corner you get to. And obviously being in a GT3 you have ABS. The other two classes aren't as lucky. So it's going to cause a lot of issues, a lot of concertina. So be very, very careful into turn 1. Especially with the LMP3s, which tend to be a little bit more on the dicey side in these daily races. So be very, very careful of that. Second of all, 2 times energy and fuel consumption as always. So it means you only get around 12.5 laps, probably 13 laps of energy when you're lifting and coasting. So again, that's not going to be the full race. That'll probably be around 25 laps or so, roughly, maybe 24 laps. And I think the race will be a little bit longer than that. Obviously, it's a 40-minute race. The lap is around a 150, let's say, as an average for the GT3s. So it's going to be probably mid-30s, upper 30s laps total, I'd say. As regards for car choice, Monza's always a bit of a weird one. Obviously, in the past, the McLaren's been extremely strong. I'm not so sure that that's going to be the case now. I think the Lexus is going to be a very, very strong pick. The Aston Martin, the Corvette, the Mustang. I think those sort of cars, the ones with the power, the acceleration, are going to be the ones to pick. But, you know, who knows? I could be surprised by the BMW or something later in the week as well. So don't rule the BMW out, but I think the main car is going to be, you know, your Mustangs, your Astons, your Lexus, maybe your Corvette if you're brave enough. But yeah, let's see what the other daily races have in store for us this week. And now for the WEC Experience daily races. To probably everyone's dismay, we have Kota. So one of the most difficult tracks in LMU, if not the most difficult in my opinion. I tend to struggle here. I think it's very, very technical and very, very difficult. And obviously, it's not a track we see that often in the dailies, so it's going to catch a lot of people out. So let's get into how difficult this behemoth of a track is. Let's come into turn 1. Uphill turn 1, which means you can brake deceptively late. We brake pretty much at the digiboard, which is obscured by my windscreen wiper. Very nice of it. There you go. So, yes. So the digiboard there, that is where we brake. Down to gear 1, turning quite late because it's very easy to hit this inside curb and you don't really want to do it because it's quite elevated and it does tend to really inhibit traction. And back to throttle. Hooking the right hand curb to make sure that we get, you know, a bit of front end grip. You tend to wash out quite a lot if you don't hook this. But be very careful because the car does tend to rotate a little bit aggressively through there. Now coming into already the hardest part of the circuit. This entire Sector 1/Sector 2 section. And it's all about, what you'll see is it's all about patience, you know, all about being very, very smooth and almost a bit passive. You know, you need to really respect the car, respect the track, because otherwise you're just going to spin or bottom out on a curb. You need to be really, really gentle. You can see slight brake there. You can see we're pretty much coasting. A little bit of throttle over the curb just to stabilise the car and also to lift the front a bit off the ground so we don't just completely slam into that sausage curb and bounce into Narnia. Bit of a dab of the brakes again. You can see we're only really braking while the car is straight, and you can actually see that with the steering. We are only braking when the car is straight. Off the brake again, start to turn in. Use a bit of throttle again as we hit that sausage curb just to stabilise the rear and get the car from corner to corner. And then again, slight dab of the brake when we straighten up. We're not fully straight here, but you can see the car's trajectory is more or less straight. Using a bit of throttle to get the car around the corner, but not too much. Making sure you hook both parts of this curb. Because you need to keep the car as far to the right hand side as you can. You can see we're actually right on the right hand side. So you can see we're actually on the white line pretty much, which means that we set ourselves up really nicely for this left-hander. It's a rather annoying left-hander. We get on the left-hand curb, we're able to hook it nicely, which means we come out of this corner quite far to the left-hand side. So you don't want to run out right to the curb. You can see we've left, pretty much half the track to the right-hand side, which means that we have, enough time and we're able to work our way across to the left-hand side to get through the final part of this corner, final part of this sector, sorry. Turn a little bit late, hit the back of this corner, hook the sort of red and white and the red part of the tarmac on the right hand side to set up our exit. So it's quite important to turn in quite late for this corner because there is more grip than you think, and you want to try and hook the exit part or hook the back part to make sure you have a straight exit here and keep the car on the track limits here. These track limits on this corner are brutal, absolutely brutal. Like you can see here, we are just within track limits, but if you so much as touch the white line with your left wheels, invalidation straight away. So that's why this part of the corner, this part of the lap, where you hook to the right hand side, and you're almost being a bit, again, setting up the entire sector almost just for these last two corners. It's so important because of the track limits. So that's something really to bear in mind. And now you get a bit of breathing room to probably what is the most important corner on the circuit, because it's the hairpin before the extremely long back straight, which is pretty much the largest overtaking zone on the track, even though this hairpin zone is an overtaking spot in itself. So be very wary of that. But obviously a lot of people, if you tend to go for the overtake into this hairpin, you're just going to get driven past down the next straight. So this corner, I would say, is very, very important on this track. So you see we break out the motul sign on the right hand side, which is essentially the 100-meter board. Keeping on the right hand curb for as long as possible, down to gear 1. Hooking the inside curb slightly. Again, GT3s generally you'll be able to do this, whereas the hypercars you will not, so bear that very much in mind. We get on the throttle pretty much as we're about to hit the curb. Get nice on throttle rotation. Making sure again to get the car firmly within track limits, because these track limits here are pretty harsh as well, just like the previous corner. And now you get a massive break. Not as much as what you'd get at Le Mans, for example, or Fuji, but it's pretty darn close to Fuji at least. You get a lot of time to breathe and relax, but again, not too much, because this is the most irritating and most difficult braking zone on the circuit. Simply because of one very visible feature of this circuit, and that is the downhill section. So the track actually slopes down into this braking zone. And boy, does that really affect your braking. In stark contrast to turn 1, where you're braking uphill, you're braking downhill here, which means that you have to brake deceptively early into this corner. And you can see we brake just before the Michelin board at the 100-meter board, or the 100-meter point, probably about 120 meters. So use that as a braking point. I think some cars you will be able to probably brake at the Michelin board, depending on some cars that obviously have better brakes, but that's something to bear in mind. It will be between those two previous boards, obviously. Down to gear 1, see we trade in, use the steering to slow the car down a bit because I did brake a little late. But the ideal scenario is where you just hook this inside curb, which we do just about. Not exiting too wide, because again you can invalidate here, but you want to make sure you can bring the car over to the left hand side as much as possible. You can see here we're on the left hand curb, almost straight for braking, down to gear 1. Throwing the car in and trading it in pretty much the entire braking zone. Through the right hander, hooking the inside curb, but again not touching the sausage, because if you touch the sausage you're just going to bottom or bounce and it will just... it's not good, basically. But you can see we exit nice and narrow. Let the car flow towards the left-hand side. Braking just at this left-hand curb here. Forgot to pause. But braking just at that entry curb, or the apex curb on the left. And then to gear 1. Not going too wide, because you don't really need to use all that road. The exit is not hugely crucial here, because it's a very short run to the next corner. But you can see here, crucially, we do still get a nice exit. We're able to apply the throttle fully on the apex. We exit within track limits, and we're to bring the car over to the left-hand side, more or less before the triple right-hander in sector 3. You can see we have a slight left mid-corner, back on the throttle as we hit this apex curb, letting the car rotate through here, keeping the car over to the right-hand side, letting him run out a little bit here, but again, not too far, because you'll leave yourself too much work to do for the second to last corner. You can see we managed to get over, mostly to the left-hand side, braking sort of midway between the two Avis boards on the right-hand side, down to gear 3. Back on the throttle just before the apex, but again, making sure to keep the car within track limits. That was a relatively conservative corner from me. Probably could have taken a bit more entry speed, but nonetheless, we get a good exit, get within track limits, and gearing up to the final corner where you brake just after this tarmac access road on the right-hand side. We brake just at the end of it, down to gear 2. Trailing in, hitting the back of the curb, turning in a little bit later to make sure you prioritise your exit, just to keep the car within track limits, and that is a lap of COTA. So, first and foremost, it's a WEC experience race, which means you have a multi-class. You have LMGT3s and you have hypercars, and that's particularly important because the hypercar tyres are still relatively new, still very raw, and this time you've not got access to tyre warmers. So, at COTA, first sector, on lap 1, you can have hypercars which are in, obviously you're not going to be freezing cold tyres, you'll be around 50 degrees, which is, again, still 30 degrees below the optimal temperature range. So there will be crashes, there will be spins, there will be incidents, probably pile-ups, so be very, very, very wary that is just going to happen. It is the inevitable scenario. And also, obviously there is a pit stop. I don't know if people will change tyres. I doubt it. As I say, it's only a 40-minute race. And while there is 2 times fuel and energy, there's not 2 times tyre wear. So that probably shouldn't be an issue. But be very wary that if people do end up changing tyre, for the first sector or the first half of the lap, they will be slower than the GT3s through the corners. So be very, very cautious and very aware of that fact. Obviously, as I mentioned, 40-minute race, 2 times energy, so you will need to pit. You do only get, you're only going to get, just over half the race distance, so you will need to pit in the race. And I would also advise that because this track is very, very brutal on its tyres, lift and coast, utilise that quite a lot. If you need to understand how lift and coast works to save energy, we do have a video about virtual energy usage and consumption, so make sure to click that in our YouTube channel. Car choice. What sort of cars are we going to be running for this race? So, in the past, the cars that were very, very strong were the likes of the McLaren, the Lexus, the Porsche, the Corvette. I don't think that's going to change a huge amount. I think the Lexus is still going to be very strong. It's an incredibly strong race car now. With the BOP finally fixed, we've also got the Porsche, which is always pretty good. It's better on virtual energy now, and it's very good on tyre drop, which again at COTA is going to be extremely important. Dark horses might be the Fords, might be the Aston. Those cars seem to struggle a little bit on the previous BOP, but the assumption would be that they're a little bit quicker now. And obviously they're both good race cars. The Aston is very good on tyre wear. The Ford not so much, but it's just a safe pick and quite intuitive to drive in my opinion. Another good shout could be the Mercedes. The Mercedes is a lot better on virtual energy now, and again is pretty decent in endurance in general, or well on tyre wear I should say, in a longer stint. So by all means see how it goes, but those are my kind of recommendations for COTA. So without further ado, let's get into the LMG3 fixed race for this week. Okay, and last but least in my opinion, because I'm not a fan of this circuit, we've got Portimao. So very, very difficult dailies this week. Obviously you've got Kota and Monza, and they've got Portimao, which in my opinion is one of the, again, like Kota, one of the more difficult tracks on LMU. So let's see how to do a lap. So first things first, come down towards turn 1, which is a downhill braking zone, which means that you need to brake deceptively early, and it's also a very abrupt turn 1 with a very blind exit and a very tough track limit. So got a lot to take in even just for turn 1. But you can see we brake just before the 100-meter board, down to gear 2, short shift to gear 3, back to the throttle, making sure to not extend track limits too much, and we keep it within track limits. You'll notice I took the throttle very late after the corner, and I mean, usually you'd want to try and take the throttle at the curb, but because I carried so much roll speed in, if I'd have done the throttle application earlier, we'd just understeered off the track, and you can see we fortunately just keep it within the track limits, so that's something to bear in mind. Now, coming into the second proper corner, brake just before this white line on the ground. I'm assuming it's a 50-meter board. Down to gear 1, making sure to not turn in too early, because if you hit the yellow sausage curb, you're just going to bounce too wide, or you're going to, spin because the car will bottom. But you can see we just hook the red and white, making sure to keep the car as far to the right-hand side as we possibly can. And you can see here, we're pretty much on the white line, which means we're able to take the car through the uphill left. Despite a bit of sliding, we keep it pinned. Keep the throttle completely flat. So it is very difficult, but very crucial to get this exit right, because you come down to the next hairpin where there is an overtaking opportunity. So make sure to try and get the exit, prioritized. Sacrifice a bit of the hairpin raw speed to, keep the car to the right-hand side and get a straighter exit, more direct exit. And again, keep the car within track limits here is also very important. And now, coming down to another downhill braking zone, braking just after the left-hand entry curb, or the left-hand apex curb for the MotoGP layout. You can see that's just about to go off our screen now, and then we start braking. Down to gear 1, and then hitting the apex on the curb on the left, letting it hook us around a little bit. Again, not taking too much, because if you hit the sausage curb or hook it too much, the car will just react badly and you'll lose a lot of time. Back to the throttle, not going full throttle, just slowly applying it because you're very, very traction limited. The car does not respond well to camber at this circuit, and obviously there's a lot of it. So you need to be very, very patient on the throttle, not going flat out like you would normally. You need to be very, very respectful of the car and its rear tyres, and be a little bit more patient. And now coming to what is, in my opinion, the hardest corner on the circuit. We're not even going to brake, I don't think, into here. Okay, slight brake while we're straight. You can see we downshift, but you can see we're keeping the throttle on. And that's very crucial, because if you don't do that, at least in the Ferrari, you will just spin. So certain cars do require a lot more finesse and a lot more, proactivity to make sure the car is stable through this corner. And obviously, you're trying to keep the car stable, but also trying to scrub off speed, because the next corner is an uphill, very difficult cambered right-hander, which is deceptively tight. You can see we're going in nice and slow, again coasting quite a bit, because if you try and trail, the car will just spin in the camber, or it will tramline wide, depending on the car, but in this car at least, you'd spin. So you can see we're very, very patient on the throttle, or very, very patient on the pedals. Mid-corner, getting back onto the throttle. Again, similar to the previous traction zone, you need to be really patient and really smooth, because the car does just like to spin on the exit here. So you've got to be really patient, not be too aggressive on the throttle, not be too aggressive on the inputs, because again, you will get bitten very, very hard at this circuit. And let's have a look at how to do that section on Coach Dave Delta. So, you join me once again on Coach Dave Delta. So, let's have a look at this double right-hander in Sector 2. So, first and foremost, very jaggedy pedal inputs. That's the first thing I'll note. And again, a lot of that is because of the Ferrari being very, very sketchy in this corner. And I say that's a trend for most of the mid-engine cars, honestly. And even some of the front-engine cars. Just in general, that corner is a massive problem child with the balance. The car doesn't, as I said, doesn't really cope with camber very well. The car does like to kind of slide in the camber, and as I say, both of these corners are cambered. So it's very, very important to be very wary of what the car's going to do. The car will dance around quite a lot, so be very, very cautious. You see we are jagged on the throttle, nice and smooth. You see we get back to the throttle again just before hitting the brake. And again, we're only hitting the brake while we're straight. That's very, very important, making sure that you're only braking when the car is, you know, not loading up to one side or the other. It's only to the front. And again, similar to what I mentioned at Kota, you want to make sure that the car is not braking while you're turning in, because the car will just spin. And that's very important in a corner with so much camber, where the car will not respond correctly and will not respond as you want it to. You need to be very, very wary of that. And you can see we hit the brake when we're straight, and then as soon as we're starting to turn, that's where we trail off. And you see we don't even touch the brake for the rest of the corner. We have a little bit of a coasting phase here, and then sort of applying the throttle gradually as we get past the apex. So it's a very deceptive corner, and it's one that you want to try and roll speed into rather than brake super late and, you know, brake later. You want to roll speed through rather than trying to brake late. And that is honestly a trend of this circuit as well. Maybe not so much the hairpins, but at least for turn 1, and also the uphill double right-hander, you can see, like, we could have broke a bit later than what we did, but we crucially are rolling, you know, coasting through the corner, and you can see we're coasting quite a bit. Obviously, there's a little brake input here, but for that most part, we are coasting, and, you know, we're rolling the speed through rather than braking as late as we possibly can, throwing the car in. You know, we're being a lot more measured and a lot more patient and smooth. And that is definitely something to consider at Portimao, in the corners that aren't hairpins. And obviously there are a lot of hairpins at this circuit. So, and now, a blind corner. You see we can't see anything. We're just going to go flying into the void. If only that were the case. But no. So you can see we're coming into this double right-hander. We're going to use this 50-meter board on the left-hand side as a reference. And as soon as that goes off screen, we're going to start braking. And we're going to brake dead straight and just pray we've got the trajectory right. But usually, I kind of aim for... So I kind of know that the middle of the circuit is where you want to be into here. And I start turning really at this marshal post. Or I start pointing the car up at the marshal post. You can see we point up. And then as soon as we get to the 50-meter board, we straighten up and brake. And that usually means you're about the middle of the circuit. And it means you can kind of, you know, trail the car around, hook the inside curb at the apex, and then get a straightforward exit. So that's generally what I use, is start pointing the car up at the marshal post. And I'll actually just show that for more clarity as well. So let's just go here. So you can see this marshal post here on the left-hand side. We start turning at that point, or start pointing the car up at that point. And then we use the 50-meter board, which we see just after the marshal post. Those are my 2 reference points. And as I say, once you understand how that feels to use those reference points, you won't need them eventually. You'll just do it by feel and pure intuition, which, of course, when the corner is completely blind, that's usually what you need. So anyway, we trade off the brake, hit the curb on the right-hand side, get back on the throttle. Luckily, you can be a bit more aggressive on the throttle there, because the car is, you know, not too, you know, unloaded in the camber, and the corner is relatively flat. And now coming into the second to last proper corner, you want to brake at the white line on the right hand side, down to gear 1. You want to kind of trail the car in a little bit as well. You can see we're not braking parallel to the white line, we're kind of braking almost towards the corner slightly, but not too much, because otherwise we'll just be, you know, squaring off the corner too much and make the corner a lot tighter than what it actually is. Especially since you want to prioritise keeping a very narrow exit. As you can see here, you get back on the throttle, keeping the car nice and narrow. You know, we probably could have kept it a bit more to the left-hand side, but we probably would have compromised our corner unnecessarily by doing that. So you can see we let the car run out, but we bring the car right over to the left-hand side again in time for the penultimate corner. Not a full braking zone, because again the corner is quite shallow, but obviously it's downhill, so you still got to be a bit careful of that. The car does like to get a little bit nervous into here. You see we hook the inside curb and getting back on the throttle just as we get off the curb. Make sure to keep the car relatively narrow, because if you run out too wide, you'll just lose time. You can see we keep the car quite narrow on the exit, but let the car run out to the curb. And then the final corner, take a slight lift at the middle of the corner. Back on the throttle. As we get over that crest, there's like a massive bump as we get to the crest, which you can see the car kind of reacts to there. And that's when you want to get back to the throttle. So it is very important, the last corner, to, let the car do its thing. If you need to lift or you need to take a dab of the brake even, do it. Make sure you do it, because if you understeer off the track, you'll just completely obliterate your tyres. And you'll understeer off the track. And again, because Portimao is so brutal on tyres, even in only a 20-minute fixed race, it will still be a massive factor because of those tyre warmers. So that is a lap of Portimao. I believe it's 44.2, I think it was, on race fuel. But let's go into the stuff that we need to consider for this fixed daily race. So, for Portimao, obviously, it's a fixed setup race on tyre warmers. And now, I want to talk about tyre warmers a little bit, because usually, you wouldn't have to think about them too much. Obviously, you know that the tyres are going to be hot, and they're going to be a little bit warmer than they would normally be, obviously for the first few laps, and then they start to even out. But at Portimao, that's a different story. The temperatures get really, really hot, especially in these conditions that we have for this week. I was getting to around mid-90s on the temperatures, and obviously with the fixed setup, you can't open the ducts, and I think the Ferrari fix was already on open ducts anyway, so that's going to be something to very much bear in mind across this daily race. Even though it is a 20-minute race, there will be tyre degradation involved. The tyres will start to drop off and they will overheat, so be very, very wary of that. And if anything, I'd say, push a little bit less on race fuel. Be a little bit more patient and be a little bit more smooth, because the car and the race will come back to you as the race goes on. Obviously, as I said, 20-minute race, you will probably need around 45% virtual energy. I think it's around 12-lap race, maybe 13 laps. But yeah, 44% I think was around 14 laps for me, so that should be perfectly fine. 45% is always safe. And as for car choice, it's a little bit of a weird one for me. Obviously, it's a mechanical grip track rather than an aero track, so that means that cars like the Lexus and the Fords are going to prosper quite well, because they're very good on in those low-speed corners. But also, Porsche is always going to be very strong. Porsche has that traction, and obviously it being such a traction-limited circuit, the Porsche is going to prosper quite well. And you've also got cars like the Corvette, which is very, very strong, but obviously will be brutal on its tyre temperatures. Maybe the dark horse could be the Aston. I tried that previously, and it felt pretty nice for me. So, that is it for the LMGT3 daily races on Le Mans Ultimate this week. I've been Luke Whitehead on the Coach David and One Ultimate YouTube channel. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, leave a comment down below for any videos you want to see, as we are constantly bringing out long form content. There's plenty of stuff already to see on the channel, so leave any comments and questions of stuff you want to see. So take care, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.